it's a very difficult situation, obviously, when you've got one of the world's great military powers attacking a neighbor unprovoked and with the ability to actually keep fighting more or less indefinitely, with, no matter what obstacles it faces along the way. And I think you've also got a situation where, for a number of months after the wider war broke out in 2022, the Europeans were fairly unified, opposing Russia, willing to impose sanctions. The Americans were willing to send weapons, and gradually the nature of these weapons was getting more and more sophisticated, so that it did seem possible that ultimately Ukraine would be getting F-16s and other things, and then missiles that could actually reach into Russia, reach deep into Russia, which would really have changed the course of the war, because it would mean that Russia was never really sure where the next one was going to come from. Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other cities would have been very vulnerable. And Biden, in two minds, one, yes, he wants to help Ukraine. Two, he doesn't want to start World War III. And three, he's kind of reluctant to do anything that might result in some kind of use of nuclear weapons by Russia, tactical nuclear weapons, let's say, in the war in Ukraine. And the result of that was that everything stayed in a kind of frozen conflict, and little progress was made. I saw the intrusion into Kursk as quite interesting. I thought it revealed that Russia was fairly weak in its border regions, that it not really paid any attention to attacks from any other quarter other than the Donbass. And to suddenly move in that direction took them by surprise. But on the other hand, in order to do that, Ukraine is moving heavily needed forces from the Donbass to the Kursk region. And once they're there, it's kind of limited how far they can go. I mean, the major city of Kursk, for example, has not been affected, and gradually Russia is addressing that. So it's very difficult. And I think even if you look at the domestic situation as well, I've often thought to myself that we don't, I'm an observer, I'm an analyst, I'm an observer, but you don't hear much about people other than Zelensky. If you look at Ukraine today, most Westerners think Zelensky. What is Zelensky doing? And it's almost like he's taken over every facet of life, so that in order to know anything about Ukraine, you just listen to Zelensky. But in fact, if you look at some opinion polls, very different opinions across Ukraine about where things are and where they should go. And Zelensky is not always, front and center of everybody's thought, I think, particularly in the West, in the Ukrainian diaspora in the West, where I think that the opinions of Zelensky are fairly mixed. And he's done some rather odd things as well, removing Zaluzhny at a very early point in the war when he seemed to be having some success. And in general, he doesn't tolerate any kind of dissent within his leadership. It's a very military style leadership now, led by himself. He's the one who always goes on missions. I mean, can you even imagine, a discussion of Ukraine anywhere in the world where Zelensky is not the person who is representing Ukraine? Yeah. And I think, that for me presents a problem in the future, in that there has to be a group of leaders who are prepared to take over when Zelensky finally steps down. And it is a little vulnerable to me just to be led by one person. But I saw that as fairly clear, fairly obvious, that it would be very difficult for Ukraine to advance when Russia's applying this kind of warfare of attrition, basically, where they're simply moving gradually, blowing towns and cities to bits until it's impossible for anyone to remain there, and then moving forward. And they're going very, very slowly. I mean, if they advanced at this rate, they wouldn't capture Kiev even for the next 2 or 3 years at that same rate. So what is the answer to that? How do you stop that kind of advance taking place. And I think Ukraine's had a lot of success with drones. They've had a lot of success clearing the Russian fleet out of the Black Sea area. They've had success hitting targets like oil refineries in Russia. These are all things, I think, that Ukraine can continue doing quite successfully. The bigger question, and that's the one I did raise in the article, is how long Ukraine can sustain these kind of losses. And if they do go to this very vulnerable age group, 18 to 25, this is a very critical part of the Ukrainian gene pool, and you would really need these people for Ukraine to have a viable future as an independent state. I mean, this is the weakest age group, numbers-wise, demographically-wise, in Ukrainian society, men aged 18 to 25. I do know that if you look at the percentages of the different age groups in Ukraine, the over 60 age group is larger than the 18 to 25 age group. So that presents a certain problem. And it also means, of course, that the Ukrainian army is quite often fairly senior people. I mean, up to the age of 59, fighting in the field, which may present, some kind of mobility issues, response issues, things like that, when you've got such an elderly army. And the Russians don't have that problem because their conscription is just for a year. They can throw people in for a year from anywhere in that younger age group, knowing that they're going to get out again. And they're using prisoners, of course, in some respects, hardened criminals who are let out of jail on the promise that they'll get their freedom if they can survive for 6 months or a year. So there's those problems. And Ukraine's having problems with conscription. I mean, I think we've all seen videos of this, people being rounded up off the streets in fairly violent fashion. And, this again is unfortunate, but it indicates a lack of willingness on the part of some potential recruits to fight for a cause where they're very likely to be killed, and there's little chance of success in the near future. That's very hard to tell people. Going to war, you're going to be there for a long time. We don't really know when you'll be out again. And I can understand the reasoning of reluctance to go, quite frankly. The difficulty is you've got a leadership in power that's completely unpredictable. And if you look at how they offered to resolve the situation in Gaza, this kind of cowboy idea of, Americans are going to take it over and build casinos there or something. How is this applied to the other major war in the world, in Ukraine? It doesn't augur very well that, you wouldn't expect Trump and Musk, who's obviously behind a lot of Trump's decision making, would agree that the fighting could only stop if Ukraine is given back all the territory that Russia has occupied. So, but the question is, what guarantees would Ukraine have in this case if you come to a negotiated peace that war won't break out again in 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, or whenever? Even if Putin's gone, there are people in that Security Council who are backing the war quite strongly. And it's very hard to see Russians in any kind of position of authority today in Russia who are opposed to this war. There are a few obvious voices that we've heard from Garry Kasparov and others, but they're people in exile. They're not people with any real count in Russia. So then logically you've got to think, well, what can Ukraine retain and how can it retain them? And I think it has to have some guarantee. I mean, the Budapest Memorandum collapsed completely because nobody backed it up. Of course, the Russians didn't, but neither did the Americans or the British. And that was the only guarantee that the Ukrainians had of retaining all their territory for the loss of their nuclear weapons. Ukraine can build its own nuclear weapons, but how quickly can it build nuclear weapons realistically, particularly given the devastation that's been caused by the war? If it gives up territory, what territory would it agree to give up? And I would say that you would have to differentiate territory that you cannot possibly get back and territory that is really yours. With no negotiation, for example, on Kherson or Zaporizhia. This is clearly territory that belongs in Ukraine, but the vast majority population there wants to be in Ukraine. Crimea and, let's say, Donetsk, Luhansk, a little bit more iffy. Those regions have not been controlled by Ukraine for a decade now. So even if, let's say, the whole of Donetsk and Luhansk regions back in 1991, back even in 2013, if you'd had a referendum there, they would have voted to stay with Ukraine. Now, it's unlikely because there's so much population moved in there. There's military regimes, ethnic Russians moving in as well. You would not, even in a free vote, even in a, Kuzio's style referendum, you would not get a vote in Ukraine's favor in those two regions, nor would you in Crimea either. So if you lost those regions, do you still have a viable state? If Ukraine could keep Kherson, keep Zaporizhia, would it still be viable as a state in the center of Europe? The answer is probably it would, but it would have to be guaranteed either by NATO, not even NATO membership, but guaranteed by NATO, or some kind of UN force that would stay in the border for the next 10 years and make sure that there were no changes there. It can't be something like the OSCE because it's not strong enough. A UN mandated force, which would include, for example, Americans or Chinese or Indians, wherever. It could obviously be an amalgam of different ethnic groups from UN, would be the only guarantee. And I've thought about this a lot, I mean, that you come to a stage where you don't want to give up anything. That's the position, right? You cannot give up a single foot of land to the occupants. But the second question is, how are you going to get it back? How do you propose to get this land back? Who is going to support it? And unfortunately, you don't have the United States behind you, which is really the only power that could do it, at least for the next 4 years. You don't have the United States backing. And I've said this for quite a long time. You need China in there as well. And you need at least one more major power other than EU, United States, Canada. I think you need China, Turkey, are the obvious ones. India would be if it wasn't so unpredictable. But if you could get China on board, and it's offered peace terms before, we know that, it's a power that is just widely distrusted in Western countries. But at the same time, if China was one of the guarantors and Russia reinvaded, then I think you would have a serious confrontation. It's not been considered, it's never been considered purely for political reasons, ideological reasons. This is another communist state. But China's not a war, it's not a warmonger. It's not a state that really needs to prove itself by military conquest. It builds economic power, it builds itself on trade. And it's done that successfully for a number of years by avoiding getting involved in wars, which is not done since the early 1970s or something. It was the last time China was involved in any kind of war. I mean, in some respects, it's not entirely unjustified to ask countries to meet their quotas of the NATO budget. But the fact is, he's raised that quota now to 5%, instead of 2%. Our country couldn't even make the 2% until 2032, according to Trudeau's statement. So I am in support of a more viable military deterrent in this country, as well as in the EU countries. I think it's coming to that, and we have to accept the fact that things have not changed in Russia for a long time now. And although Putin is 72 years of age, he's 6 years younger than Trump. He looks a lot fitter than Trump. and he looks like, you know, his end is not coming anytime soon. And he's now put Russia on a footing where it's simply trying to bully its way around in international diplomacy. It's not a friendly nation. There's no way you can reach an agreement with this country, or, you know, every country that's vulnerable will be a target of this Russia. And currently it's Ukraine. And if it wasn't Ukraine, it would be, I anticipate, Georgia, Moldova, and then the Baltic states, in that order, and then possibly even Poland. And I think Poland is actually well aware of this. I mean, Poland has been building up its military for some time. And I think the idea that you would have a viable deterrent without the United States is faulty. You know, you need the United States there. You cannot really deter Russia without the United States on your side. That's just a fact. And the United States is still sending weapons to Ukraine. I mean, they're still doing it from the old legislation under Biden. It's not going to stop immediately. The other thing that might be a possible optimistic air is that all these things that Trump has been doing, he's been doing by emergency decree, or, you know, presidential decree. He's not put anything through Congress and the Senate. Mm. And when Congress and the Senate has to vote on things like future aid to Ukraine, I think they'll still support it. I don't think Trump's got the votes to push that through. And therefore, you will have a confrontation between Trump and Musk on the one hand, and the Congress and Senate on the other. And 2 years down the road, there's the midterm elections as well. And I think many congressmen are thinking about that. And if you wholesale abandon Ukraine, that's going to be a very unpopular decision in some constituencies. So I don't think it's going to continue quite as extreme as it is right now. But right now, it's just chaos. It's been put on the list by Musk. I've not heard any statement from Trump supporting that. Voice of America too. But you know, the reason Musk is giving that they're all leftist radicals is so far-fetched. And if anything, you could use the other argument that it's actually set up by right-wing government to stop the spread of communism. That was the original rationale behind Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And they're two different organizations, right? I mean, Radio Free Europe, was it Musk who said Europe's basically free? Okay, well, that also begs the question where Europe ends, obviously, because Ukraine is part of Europe. But Radio Liberty looked at Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and other places. It's looking at the places where the war is still taking place. It's looking at places like Belarus where they don't have a free press, and Russia where you're only going to get one opinion, and that's the opinion of the regime. It's needed now more than it ever was until back into the Soviet period. So it's a specious argument that's being put forward against Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe. But, you know, you've got a regime in power that's not acting in a logical fashion. Well, not much. I mean, I think you've got a state of martial law, which has really slowed down the process of dealing with corruption, legal reform, things like that. And you don't really hear very much. And if you look at the Ukrainian media, you don't read very much about these processes. It's more, you know, it's just more about basic survival right now. And I think that's the priority. And you cannot have any elections, so you can't really put yourself to the population. It would be very hard to hold elections when you've got bombs dropping all over the place and people, you know, some areas so devastated that people couldn't even get to the polling stations. Mm. So if you've got that situation, it's going to be like that for some time. And, you know, I think it would be good for Westerners to perceive a kind of coalition government in Ukraine running the war rather than just one individual, because you're only going to get that opinion But you can see people like Poroshenko and others being quite critical of the leadership on their own websites, their own Facebook pages, rather than collaborating with them, and let's say till the war is won. I mean, I don't know, but if you look at the presidents so far, they've been initially they were part of the old establishment, virtually all of them, one way or another. Right from Kravchuk all the way down to Poroshenko, they were all part of the same establishment, even if some were communists, some were not, some were business people, some were not. Zelensky wasn't, so he's like the first one that came from the real outside. And yet, even if you look closely at him, you can see business interest behind him. You can see Kolomoisky there. You can see that he had his own little business empire. He managed to make the WikiLeaks list and things like that with his holdings outside the country. So perhaps even him, he's not entirely outside. It is a wealthy man. He was a wealthy man when he became president. There may be an opportunity, I think, now, given the upheavals, if Ukraine can get out of this in some respects, if it can get back to civilian life and end this military operations, if it gets a chance to do that, there's a greater chance of moving forward than there was back in 1991 or 2013, for example, because things have changed. Things have obviously changed quite dramatically. And people want a Ukraine that can be built anew. And because of the devastation, it does give an opportunity for external investment into Ukraine's industries, into Ukraine's raw materials that perhaps you didn't have before. And I think there would be an opportunity there, because I think there's a commitment by the West in particular to do that. And I think other powers as well would be drawn in, provided that Ukraine can remain a state. That has to be the priority for me. You have to have a guarantee of a future independent Ukrainian state, whether those borders are stable or whether they're policed by military forces from the UN. One way or another, that has to be a permanent fixture. You cannot be in flux all the time. If you look at Georgia, it's been in a constant flux since about 2008 or so. Moldova, the same thing since the early 1990s. It's never had a complete territory, and Russia will not allow them to have a complete territory because it strengthens them. And even more so with Ukraine, they will take as much as they can possibly get. So the priority is to make sure they get as little as possible. And if they don't get Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, Ukraine can survive. I'm convinced that Ukraine will still survive. If they get more than that, it's going to be extremely difficult. And again, there's got to be some outside assistance for that to be achieved.